Hello, and welcome to this extra shot episode in the Project Zion podcast series. I'm your host, Blake Smith, and I am here today with two esteemed guests and very good friends of mine who are well known to you, our listeners. It's Tony and Charmaine Chavala Smith. Welcome, Tony and Charmaine.
Good to see you, Blake.
Be with you today.
Unlike some of our listeners, I did not have the honor or torture of taking a class and taking the tests that Tony and Charmaine put together. I made it through seminary. I might not have had I been their student, but we've been good friends for a long time. And it's my first time to sit down with you guys. You guys have, I'm probably used to sitting with either Carla or Karen, but today you get me.
Yay.
Yay. So we're putting this shot in the extra shot. I'm sorry, we're putting this episode in the extra shot category because it's in response to a listener request for some more information. And it's really about something that you, Tony, mentioned in episode 649, Theohistory Review and Vision for the Future, which, of course, I would encourage all of our listeners, if you have not listened to the Theohistory series, to go back and listen to that. It's a series that Karen Peter has hosted with both Tony and then Locke Mackay. Great series. But in that episode, Tony, 649, Karen asked you what you thought would carry forward in our story as we look toward the future. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to focus on claiming and living into our true identity. And you specifically mentioned the importance of a center point. You also referred to some important boundaries like the Mormon boundary and the Evangelical boundary, and that's where the question really comes from. So, Tony, can you give our listeners some context that led to that in case they had not heard the other episode, and then unpack that for us? And Charmaine can join in. Charmaine wasn't part of that episode, but she was referenced because she has great ideas. So.
Sure, I can get us started here, and Charmaine and I will tag team back and forth in this episode today. So, who are we, and who are we becoming? That's the identity question, and that's been a question on the table for Community of Christ for 60 plus years. Prior to the early 1960s, we knew who we were, so we thought. We were the one true restored original church, restored by Joseph Smith Jr. And one of the things we knew about ourselves is that we also weren't the Mormons. That was very much woven into our reorganization identity. And so going into the comment I made in that podcast, we were looking ahead, what's going to guide us into the future. And one of the things I tried to say there was that Community of Christ's story and theology vector away from Nauvoo and away from some of the aspects of Joseph Smith Jr.'s theology that are more characteristic of the Mormon tradition. And I said, we really need to stay on that vector. That is who we are. And we have to keep looking to the center of our tradition. I think I used the image of the temple spiral, which is a beautiful architectural picture of the spiritual journey, spiraling round and round and going in a direction. But one of the points I made was that the architects cannot create that spiral without there being a midpoint. There has to be a center point to the journey. And the center point for the journey for Community of Christ is Jesus Christ, the divine word incarnate, who lived, taught, embodied the kingdom of God, was crucified for us, and was raised, and is present through the Holy Spirit, and is coming again, and has enlisted us in service to the creation of the reign of God. And so that's the vector we're on. That's the midpoint. And I tried to argue in that part of the podcast that actually in that whole podcast, that midpoint was present all the way back to the 1830s. We just often got off track on it. And from the Community of Christ perspective, Nauvoo theology would represent way off track from that midpoint. And so the reorganization in lots of ways became a course correction. And it became very, very important for us in our journey from, actually from 1851 on, from the new organization to the reorganization, became very, very important for us to say, this is who we are and this is who we aren't. Don't confuse us with the other group. So that's what I was getting at there. Does that help, Blake?
Yeah, that helps a lot. As a matter of fact, I just had a conversation with someone this last week, and they said that they recently realized that what Joseph Smith III was doing back at the beginning was not really reorganizing, but almost starting anew with getting us back on track. But it was so different from where we were right in the end of the Nauvoo period that it was as if it were a new beginning. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Joseph Smith III wrote, oh gosh, this is when he's in the process of accepting leadership of the church. He referred to the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants as auxiliaries to the Bible. The auxiliary fire department ain't the fire department. It's the backups,
Exactly.
Right. And so in other words, he was already in the process of thinking, we got some good stuff from that first period. We got to start over and rebuild from there. And so you could understand the history of the development of Community of Christ theology as not just a reorganization, but a reconfiguration, a redevelopment of the original as much as we can, which also includes some rejection of the original as part of the process.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those places where it's important to think about who is it that is making up the reorganization. And mostly, as you start looking at the people who they're people who had been willing to be critical of some of the directions that the theology, practices, ideology, interactions, relationships in Nauvoo were going. And so there's already that common-mindedness among the people who are making up the reorganization, that there's some things that must be left behind. And typically, many of those folks were leaning more towards foundational classical Christian beliefs and practices and away from what was happening in Nauvoo, which gives you a sense of then why is there this sense of building this Mormon boundary, this identifying line of who we haven't been, who we were at the beginning, as you were kind of saying, Blake, and then what's happened and how far we've gone from where we started, and that sense that there are some things that must be left behind in order for us as a group, the reorganization, to move forward together. So there's some consensus already among that group about what wasn't acceptable. So those are some of the elements, those are some of the bricks in the RLDS Mormon boundary that started out of necessity at its very beginning.
That really makes a lot of sense. I mean, because these folks obviously did not participate in the Great Westward Movement. They didn't follow the thought process that Brigham Young was to be the leader of the church. And so there had to have been some hesitancy that kept them back. So I've never really thought about it that way, but that's...
And if you look at the Nauvoo Expositor, the newspaper that was written and the printing press destroyed because of what it said, its critiques of, what's happening to immigrant young women who are being placed in multiple marriages without really much consent on their part. There's polygamy in other places as well. There's moving away from having moved away from a Trinitarian view of God. multiple gods. I mean, so there's a listing in the Nauvoo Expositor of those things that people are saying, oh my gosh, this is not where we want it to be. And so there is theologically, but again, by practices too, there's a group of people who are saying, wow, we can't go this way anymore. We must start again, or start in a new place. But now with a whole bunch of identifiers but we don't believe that. And we don't believe that, and we won't practice this. So there's some common. I mean, there's so much infighting in the beginnings of the reorganization. There's so much argument about theological things, but mostly it was welcomed. I mean, these were people who liked to to disagree, to dig in and think about theological things, and so. That's part of the character of the reorganization, is that it is about questioning. It is about saying, does this square? Can we find, what is it that makes us Christian? I mean, that's part of the question too. So anyhow, that's another piece that might be helpful for people.
Yeah, so there's so many things going through my head right now as you talk about. We could probably do 4 or 5 spin-off podcasts from this, just from the thing. So one of the things that I'm wondering about is the idea and theology of being the one true church. Was there some competition between the two early on?
So this is one of those places where I would start by saying, whether you're studying theology or scripture or history, the big word is context. What was happening at that time? And that your question takes us right there. And so the restoration movement that is already happening in Christianity in the 1820s, 30s, even before that, this kind of trying to restore Christianity to its original form. We're part of that. Other denominations, we're part of that as well. And so that's the instinct, is we must get back to the original New Testament church. And so there's this whole sense that we didn't, so all of the what became known as Mormons or LDS Church, and then the reorganization, our LDS Church, that's the premise they started with theologically, that we must find the one true expression of the New Testament church. And yes, we've done it. And we have renewed priesthood authority. We have the right beliefs. We have the right understanding of the afterlife, all those kinds of things. And Jesus brought this to us. Jesus established the church anew. And so that's really deep, the idea that we must have the one true church. And so, yeah, there's lots of competing, not just between groups within our movement, but among other Christians in that time period, 1810s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, everyone trying to get people to come to their one true church.
It's very interesting, too, that our church magazine, The Herald, when it first came out, was called the True Latter-day Saints Herald. So the contest was over, who are the true Latter-day Saints? Who's got the real Latter-day Saint message? And so it was the same thing Charmy's talking about. Who really has rights to being the original? And so that was part of the process of the organization trying to identify itself over against Mormonism. And also, if you're living in Illinois in 1864, 1870, and someone finds out you belong to this reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the first thing they're going to ask you is, well, are you Mormon? And the answer is no. So you didn't go to Utah? No. And you've got to start saying, here's why. Here's why I'm not X, Y, and Z. Right? So this process of this is This takes place in human development, a process of self-differentiation from your origins. I come from my dad, but I'm not my dad in this way, this way, this way, and this way. And so that was bound to happen. If you didn't go to Utah, you were going to have to explain why you didn't.
Very good. That brings up a great point, Tony. I know that we have a number of our listeners, because Project Zion Podcast began as a seekers ministry resource to provide information to those who are exploring the church. And I think over the years, it has become certainly more widely used within folks who even grew up in the tradition. But you both alluded to the fact, in one way or another, I think, Tony, you said with regard to the firefighter, we ain't the main firefighting team. We're the backup team. And that's not saying in terms of the Latter-day Saints and the reorganized Latter-day Saints or Community of Christ that one is the backup, just the distinction. And I wonder if that might be problematic for folks who have been brought up in the LDS tradition and in their search for something close to that doesn't require that they give up everything, and have migrated towards Community of Christ, many becoming members of Community of Christ. How do we answer that question, that we still need to make that distinction without making them feel like the backup auxiliary?
Sure. Well, when people migrate, like from one land to another land, they often migrate to places that feel familiar. So, for example, I'm from Michigan, which is for many months of the year is gray, dark, cold, snowy, wet. I consider it a paradise, but some people don't. But why did so many immigrants from the Netherlands, from England, and from Poland make their way to Michigan? Well, it had a familiar feel, topographically, weather-wise. Yes, if you grew up in dark, cloudy England, in parts of dark, cloudy England, Michigan just felt like home in some way. So you are attracted to things that have a familiar feel, even though you cannot find good fish and chips in Michigan, right? So in other words, it feels familiar, but there are things that are just not the same there. And so I think let's start there, that we have inherited a number of the trappings of the early Latter-day Saint movement, and so it gives a familiar feel to our community. But the issue is, how does Community of Christ interpret them? And that's actually a very much different question, right? Just because it looks and feels like something from home doesn't necessarily mean that inside the tradition it's interpreted that way, right? So in philosophy and theology, we make a distinction between formal similarity and material difference, right? So formally, the Russian Republic and the United States have constitutions. That does not necessarily mean materially that they use and interpret their constitutions in the same way. And so the same is true church-wise. We have some trappings that are familiar to people from the Mormon tradition, but materially we are such a different community. We align with the Trinitarian mainstream of the Christian tradition. We are attracted to we are attracted to the progressive Protestant side of the mainstream of the Christian tradition. We borrow language and we borrow hymns from there. And so that's where our material alignment is. Right? So you have to make a difference between these two.
Well, yeah, I can kind of build on that just a little bit too. And I think we all have talked about this, but I'm going to just remind us for our listeners' sake. If you haven't heard it before, you probably will. In Community of Christ, especially those of us who grew up when we were RLDS, and especially those of us who were involved in outreach community outreach, missionary kinds of things. And Tony and I both traveled with 70s when we were young adults. And so we did some door knocking and inviting people and neighbors to our churches for different things. And so we have joked about this at different times when we've been doing podcasts where we've said, it was a very long name. It was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, not the Mormons, because that was such an important piece to distinguish from, because as soon as people heard Latter-day Saints, they didn't recognize any of the beginning stuff. But when we said Latter-day Saints, they went right to Mormon. And so that was kind of the way to put us on a different track. But I can understand that there are some people who are Mormon who come from the Mormon Church, LDS Church, who it's like, who might feel a little bit put down because of that. But this is one of those places where understanding our LDS Community of Christ journey will be really helpful to you, to understand that this was important to our establishing our identity and having a different starting place than simply, who we aren't. So needing to give people a chance to say who we aren't so that we can begin to tell who we are. And that was very important for a lot of reasons. One is that in relation to other larger denominations, including the Mormon Church, LDS Church, we were little. We were a little tiny group. And often in whatever communities we were in, by far the minority, a small group that people didn't really know very much about. And when you are the minority, you have to be much more intentional about telling people who you are and who you aren't, giving them a starting place. And so that's going to be a piece of who we are. And it also probably, in some ways, pushed us more to what I'm going to call the Protestant boundary. So on one side, we have the Mormon boundary, who we are and who we aren't. And on the other side, we have the Protestant boundary of who we are and who we aren't. And so when we're introducing ourselves for the first time, we often had to say who we aren't and then start to help people understand who we are. We would start naming things that would identify our theology, our sacraments, things like that they would recognize as being more towards the Protestant side. So I think that's an important piece just to understand about the development of the theological self-understanding in Community of Christ. And, we can go lots of different ways with that, but would this be a good time to just share the visual?
I think it would.
So get some of these blocks out of the way here. There we go. So this is just a way, if I was a very good artist, I would have found some other ways to create pretty boundaries. But what you have here is over on the left is the eras, the time periods. And then you have Mormonism. And then in the middle, there's our LDS to Community of Christ. And on the other side, we have Protestantism. And here, so you'll see that there's some things that are closer to the Mormon boundary, and there's some things that are closer to the Protestant boundary. And those things that are in italics are those things that are creating a stronger boundary between us and another group. And the things that are not italicized are things that are strengthening or making that boundary more porous, strengthening our connection with that side of our identity. So if you're starting... Go ahead, yeah.
I just want to pause for just a second for those of our listeners who are just listening and don't have a visual of this. Okay. Charmaine is sharing a visual, and we will make sure that that's available, a link to it or itself in the show notes. So I don't want you to feel left out and say, oh my gosh, I don't know what she's talking about. She is referring to a document, and we will make that available. I'm sorry, Charmaine, go ahead.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And I'll try to be more descriptive as we go here. So if you look at the time period from the 1860s to the 1890s, 1860 being when the reorganization becomes more formalized as a group. So in those first 30 years, there was very much the need to identify who we were by the fact we're not Mormon. So as we were talking about earlier, those people who already had some major questions about where things were going theologically or socially or relationally in Nauvoo in particular. And so the reorganization has all of these identifiers that are about being against what was happening in Nauvoo. So that's really important. And there's several of the early leaders in the reorganization who voice very strongly major misgivings about Joseph Smith Jr. and some of the ways in which he led in the last 5 years or so. So that's a very different place to be coming from than where many people entered the movement 2 or 3, a decade before even. So the reorganization consists of dissenters, and then there's a very strong anti-polygamous identity. And you'll see people coming to the reorganization to the RLDS Church, who have maybe come from Utah, maybe come from other stops along the way west, or have come from some of the other splinter groups, the Strangites, and others, the whites, different groups who initially said they were against polygamy, but then people found out that their leaders were actually practicing polygamy. And they're like, no, this is something we were against. And so many of those folks who had tried following 2 or 3 of the other leaders who broke off after Joseph Smith Jr.'s death find themselves coming back to the reorganization as a place that upholds the idea of not being for polygamy. So there's a number of things there that are reinforcing we're not Mormon. And then I'm jumping ahead a little bit here and going to the 1920s to the 1950s. There's still very much the strong identity. We are still the one true church, and so we still have to identify ourselves against what Mormons believe or Mormonism as a movement. But on the other side of things, these are theological influences. So the president of the church, Fred M. Smith, he's becoming well informed and kind of on fire about the social gospel, which is a Protestant theology that is identifying systems that marginalize people and naming them and saying, and FM is saying, the cause of Zion is what the social gospel is pointing to. And then we have people like Edwards and Oakman, Edwards is an apostle, and then in the first presidency, and Oakman, an apostle, who grew up in England and are very influenced by Anglican theologians. And so Temple and Gore, 2 theologians from England, who speak to some aspects of RLDS theology, to our understandings of the sacraments, to understandings of who Jesus is. We're influenced as a movement by those people through people like Edwards and Oakman. Roy Cheville, who goes to the University of Chicago Divinity School. This is, again, more on the Protestant side. And so these are influential people in the church that are helping to make those boundaries more porous on the Protestant side of things. And then we go into the 1960s and 70s. And again, there's theological influences. Draper and Cooey, who are both counselors to the president, are reading Tillich and other Protestant theologians who are new on the scene and creating some language that's very relevant in that time. Church leaders, young adults, new appointees are feeling this call to go to seminary. And so they're being exposed to good biblical scholarship, whether that's Protestant and later Catholic scholarship as well. And they're becoming involved in ecumenical movements. And so, again, these are all things that are making that Protestant boundary more porous. Also in the 60s and 70s, the church is invited into a lot of countries where it didn't expect to be. And one of the things it had to do very quickly was to identify who it was not and who it was. Again, the name made, in some places, made people suspicious of who we were. And we also found ourselves needing to learn from other mainstream Christian missionaries how to speak to people about God and Christ. We were really good at making distinctions between us and other denominations and how we were right. And here's people for whom Christianity is a brand new thing. And so we needed to learn how do you talk to people who may not have an idea of a single God, to talk about who God is and then who Christ is. So again, very much aided and encouraged by other Protestant Christians. And then more focus on our theology focusing on God and Christ. And again, so that's pulling us more to the Protestant side. During the same time, there's becoming less focus on our own history. I think we're maybe getting to that post-adolescent time in the development of the church where we don't have to always talk about our identity. And so we're focusing a little less on our history, a little less on the Book of Mormon, a little less on our only true status, our only true, being the only one and only true church. And so those are affecting our theology. And then the baptism of polygamists in India helped us loosen our grip on our anti-polygamous identity that came from way back at the very beginning. So, all of these things, we keep moving back and forth between these two boundaries. And then also in the 60s and 70s, such an amazing time of change in the church. And many of us not really being aware of how much things were changing and how many different influences there were. But there's the New Mormon history. So this is a critical historical approach to our story. And that's happening in RLDS, Community of Christ, and it's happening in Mormonism at the same time. And so there's begins to be some collaborations and going back and forth to conferences that are talking about the critical study. So I'm going to pause there. Tony, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so sure. I mean, this is the chart. I think will be very helpful when people can see it. But I think when you look at this chart that Charmaine has created, you see that the preponderance of leaning in reorganization theology is always towards the Protestant side. That is where our deepest theological instincts tend to align. And so Charmaine used the word porous. The boundary between the reorganization and, we'll say, mainline or mainstream Protestantism, not typically evangelical or fundamentalist Protestantism, but between mainline Protestantism and us, that boundary was really became increasingly porous until, well, you jump to 2010 and the church becomes a formal member of the National Council of Churches. And so this is an important part of our identity and an important part of our trajectory. Remember I said vectoring away from Nauvoo. And our vector aligns us with a number of progressive Protestant theologians and ideas and with the mainstream of the Protestant churches. And so there's nothing to be ashamed of about that. That's who we are and who we have become. And you can see it quite dramatically pictured on the chart when you look at where the bulk of influence and weight tends to go.
And I think one of the interesting things is that we find Community of Christ and the more progressive sides of the Mormon Church, the historical people who are willing to explore the historical questions, we find more porousness there on the historical study of things, but probably less, much less actually, on the theological content between our two movements. And I think that's a distinction that's worth making. So, you look at the 1980s and ordination of women. Well, that's not going to be happening in Mormonism, but it already has been happening for decades and even hundreds of years in other denominations. Inclusive language about God and about people. Again, that's sparked and understood, and we're drawing from the resources within Protestantism, progressive Protestantism. Seminary training for our appointees, making that more of a formal requirement. We're using good Protestant and Catholic scholarship, and things like process theology and the liberation theologies. That's becoming more a standard part of what our ministers, our full-time ministers, are gaining. Gala maybe even started a little bit before this, and it's the precursor to harmony. So within the church, recognition and affirmation of our LGBTQIA family. So, but at the same time, there's Sunstone and John Whitmer Historical Association and Mormon Historical Association, where we're making connections, where there's lots of going back and forth and building of relationships. But it's mostly about analyzing, talking about our shared history, our 14 years of shared history, really only 14 years of shared history. And I think that's important to keep acknowledging. 1990s, the theological influences, again, they're on the becoming more porous, the Protestant side, increased ecumenical interfaith connections, interacting with pacifist and peace traditions, other denominations, CCM, contemporary Christian ministry within the church, which is very much more influenced more on the evangelical and the evangelical fundamentalist side, but another porousness on the Protestant side, adopting the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible as what we typically use, moving away. I probably should have put that into moving away from using the inspired version, recognizing that the inspired version is not a translation, but more like a commentary of Joseph Smith Jr. So there's all of these kinds of things. The use of the Revised Common Lectionary, using the lectionary in our worship planning, our theology becoming increasingly incompatible with Protestant evangelicals, especially the fundamentalist form of that. But then also in the 1990s, open communion, which builds some connections on both sides. On the Mormon side, where there's an openness there to sharing communion and the understanding of it, as well as on the Protestant Catholic, other Christian side. So the temple in the 1990s, a difference is we don't have temple only rites or sacraments, and on the Protestant side, dedicated to peace, reconciliation, healing of the spirit, and open to the public. So in the 2000s, name change. And so there's no more LDS monikers. There's no more Latter-day Saint identifiers in our name. Instead, we are choosing the Christ-centered aspects of our theology and our story, and that's becoming our name again, which is pulling us towards classical Christianity and their understanding of Christ as part of the Trinity. Theological changes, section 161, which talks about it's Christ-centered. It's talking about we have a unique place in the circle of those who follow Christ. That we aren't the whole thing. We're not the one. We don't have to be the one true church anymore. We can be one those who follows Christ. And then in the 2010s and 2020s, again, membership by confirmation, for some types of baptisms, which strengthens our connections on the Mormon side, being able to confirm people into the church instead of rebaptizing. And then on the Protestant side, recognizing some kinds of baptism and opening those doors a little bit more. Then same-sex couples marriage and ordination of people in same-sex relationships becomes a matter for national conferences and becomes part of our identity in many parts of the world. So, and then more official affirmation of LGBTQIA within the church. And then, as Tony mentioned, full membership of National Council of Churches of Christ. And then in the 2010s and 2030s, a more intentional open door invitation to Latter-day Seekers and having ministries around that. So again, making porous some parts of that boundary as well. And then the most recent selling of Kirtland and Nauvoo properties, that can be, I have it in the middle. It can go either way. In some ways, it can affirm that shared history on the Mormon side. And when we visit those properties as part of our story, then we will be hearing it from more of the LDS perspective. On the other side, it is kind of helping. It's letting some of our past be in the past, as far as some of our properties, and so it may be making more porous the Protestant side of things. So it's an interesting way to try and look at our identity, our changing identity in community of Christ.
Yeah, that's very helpful in seeing our journey, and I think that's something that Tony and Locke do really well in the Theo History series. Again, recommending that people go back and listen to those because that'll flesh out some of the things that you've shared here. But thank you for that. We're going to pause our conversation here. It's a great conversation, and we still have so much to discuss. I'm your host, Blake Smith, and you've been listening to an Extra Shot episode with guests Tony and Charmaine Chavala-Smith. Be sure and listen in to part 2 of Mormon and Evangelical Boundaries.